Well, today we're going to have the second episode of Tales from Classic Motor Carriages. I hope that's dramatic enough for you guys. Anyway, remember last time we talked on this very subject, I said I had actually built 14 of the original 34 coupes for Classic Motor Carriages. This is the first design. This is the design that used the Ford steering column. This is the design that used Ford or Chevy. This is the one that had a slightly different body than the ones that Classic Motor Carriages later made. Now, there's a reason for that body going out of existence. And I'm going to tell you this. Now, I was at a show down in South Florida when I met a man who actually bought one of the early 34s. He was a import-export dealer for a Colombian company. He was not in that kind of import-export, but he was a big car fan, and he would ship stuff to Colombia, and Colombia would ship certain items back to him. Not those things, other things like furniture and stuff like that. He's a very nice guy, and he has a very particular place in the CMC Cobra history, and I'm going to tell you that at the very end of this video because I think you're going to love it. Now, I'm going to attach to the Facebook post that this is going to be sent to pictures of his car. But first, let's discuss it for a while. Okay? This is literally the 15th street rod coupe, the first version that I built. And I met him at a car show. And he said, "Mike, why don't you come build my car for me? I have two guys that are working on it, but they don't speak English very good, and they don't read English even worse." So I said, okay. I went over to see it. Well, there was a lot of problems with it early on, but I straightened up all the problems. And then him and we sat down, and he made a list of all the stuff he wanted me to do to it. Now, the early versions of the Classic coupe, 34 coupe had indentations on the side cowls. Now, these indentations were used, or were basically cosmetic. They could have been used for events, and that's exactly what I did. I cut them out, and in their place I put expanded sheet metal, or rather perforated sheet metal. That's the correct term, not expanded. There's a difference. Okay, the expanded metal has little slits in it, and then they tug it and they stretch it on out. Well, perforated sheet metal has little holes stamped in it, and these particular holes were hexagon, or like a beehive. And the best way I can explain it to you is when I put these mesh on the inside, it looked exactly like the grill on a 65 Mustang, which is essentially what it was. But to get a sheet big enough to make these side grills, one on each side of the cowl, I had to actually purchase a sheet of perforated hexagon sheet metal in the same size as a 65, 66 Mustang, or 65 Mustang rather, the grill on the front. Now, why didn't I use the grill? Well, because the 65 Mustang grill wasn't big enough, so we had to use this other piece of perforated metal. We got a 4x8 sheet. We basically cut out what we need, put the rest aside, and kept going with the build. Now, he also wanted me to do a couple of other things. He wanted it to have lights that a 1934 coupe would have. To this point, I took and put cowl lamps on the side of the car. And if you ever see the picture of the car, you will see the cowl lamps on the side of the car. You'll also see on the back original 34 coupe tail lights and stuff like that. And he wanted me to do all this for him. He also wanted me to do air conditioning in his car. Well, on the original Classic 34 coupe, okay, there wasn't enough room between the firewall and the dashboard. There's just enough room for instruments. So what did I do? Well, there was a step on the firewall. It's just the same step you would see on an original 34 coupe, and we did this on purpose. We wanted it to look like a 34 coupe in the engine compartment, and it had that step on it. That piece of the firewall was actually part of the floor pan, which extended all the way to the back of the car, came all the way to the front of the car, and was right in the front where it needed to be from the but it's actually sat in underneath the what you would call the cowling on the 34 coupe. So what I did was, because there was a step here, I shortened it, and this moved the whole firewall forward enough where I could put an air conditioning up in the space between the dashboard and the firewall. And that's what we did. And it created a big problem for me because this was all done in gel coat. So I had to get a painter from Classic Motor Carriages to come over and paint the car so that our repairs would not be visible. And I put the air conditioner in. Now, he also wanted a double wiper blade system. Now, believe it or not, the first version of the Classic Motor Carriages car used a single wiper above the driver's seat. Now, it had a position for a second wiper on the other side of the car, okay? Depending on the driver's side, it had a position for a single wiper that was used on boats. And that's what we used on the prototypes. And if you see a picture of the prototype, and I'll be happy to show you one, it shows only a single wiper on there. So, what did I do? Well, I thought to myself, and I figured out a way to use Volkswagen wiper arm or wiper post, okay, and put a linkage between the two so that when one swung, the other one swung. And then I attached the original boat wiper to this linkage so that whenever one would wipe, the other one would wipe. And that's how I did. And when we did it on top of the windshield. Now, why is this all important? Believe me, it gets better. You're going to love this. So, I did that for him. He also wanted 9 gauges. And I gave him 9 gauges. He wanted a cover for the steering column because, believe it or not, the forged steering columns that we used on those things came out of Mustang 2s. And quite cumbersome and ugly. So I made a cover for it to make sure everything looked good. He also wanted an alarm. the alarm he got me to use, I rigged up with door openers. Like that, huh? However, you had to it was infrared. It wasn't a, it didn't have a radio frequency that it worked off. It worked off of infrared light. And the only way you could set these things off so that the doors would pop open was you had to stand about 10 feet back behind the rear window and aim it at a certain spot on the roof of the interior, or the headliner, where I had the transceiver, or the eye of the infrared alarm system there. And it was actually out of a Peugeot of some ancient vintage that he had on hand, and it worked well, all things considering. But it was not what you would call fully functional, like an RF would be. You can walk across a parking lot and hit the RF, and poof, the doors would open. So I did that for him. And then I put 9 gauges in there. He wanted a gauge for everything. He wanted transmission temperature. He wanted oil pressure. He wanted oil temperature. He wanted a clock. He wanted a voltmeter. He wanted an amp meter. He wanted a tach. He wanted a speedometer. He wanted a water temp gauge. And I think that's 9, isn't it? If it isn't, let me know and I'll tell you what the 9th one was. And I did that all, and we fixed it all up, and we got it painted. And he gives it to me. He says, Mike, you can drive it over to Classic and show it to him. Show him what a car's supposed to look like. It even had, on the top of the grill, it had a Ford emblem on it, molded into the fiberglass. I literally cut away the fiberglass in the shape of a Ford emblem to the point where I could just put it in there, put a nut on the back of it, screw it down, suck it into the hole, and it said Ford across the front. Looked beautiful. And of course, it was repainted by the Classic Motor Carriages guy that came over with me to make sure that thing looked perfect. So I drove it there. It caused quite a stir. As you might imagine, that here I am, the guy that works in R&D, shows up in a Classic 34 coupe with all these changes done to it. The brass looked it over quite a lot all day long, including the salesman. And the salesmen were basically agog, okay, with the changes that I had made to the car. And one of the things that this brought about was they decided we're going to incorporate these changes into the Vicky. Now, you remember it last time I had told you that somebody else was R&D'ing the Vicky and not me. Well, believe it or not, he made changes based to the Vicky body based upon the 15th street rod that I had built. Okay? This particular one that I had built for this customer outside the factory had a lot of influence, shall we say, upon the next version of the street rod line, which was the Vicky. Now, originally, they went with the Pinto Mustang 2 steering column in the Vicky. And if you have one of the Vickies with this particular column, and I've seen at least one, you have the earlier version of the Vicky. We actually made 2 because later on, okay, when I built the 34 Cabriolet as part of R&D, We swapped the steering column, threw away the Mustang too, and put in a GM column, okay? And the GM column was so much nicer and so much prettier. And that's why the Cobra uses a GM column. But that's not the only thing that this particular car got me. See, that fine gentleman I built the car for was a real car fan. I mean, he had models of every car ever made in his office, and they were fantastic. He also had a lot of books. He had practically every book written at the time on the Shelby Cobra. And when I left, after building that car for him, he gave me every book on the Shelby Cobra that he had in his possession. He gave them to me so I could have them. And that is why there are so many things different about the CMC, Fiberfab, Street Bees, Cobra compared to other kits on the market. Because I went through those books with a fine-tooth comb, and I learned so much about the Cobra and how it was built, what was built, and how many things were different about how Shelby built the Cobra. And we, or should I say, mostly me, use those books to develop the Cobra body. That's why our Cobra has no fender lip flares on the back. Now this one does, okay? And I'll be happy to tell you them. The 427s, and there are only about 46 or 427 SCs, which was the sport and competition cars built by Chevy. Now there were, or Shelby, sorry, forget that. But the original bodies, when they got to California, flown in by Pan Am on Pan Am's 707 cargo liners, believe it or not, when they arrived in there, they were on pallets, and they pulled them out and they dropped them on the tarmac at LAX airport. Didn't drop them. Basically, they were offloaded with a forklift. Okay, they put them on the tarmac. They jacked them up. They put wheels on them, and then they started rolling them into Shelby's factory at LAX. But those cars, the original Cobras that came on over from England that were slated to have the 427 and 428 engines put into them, okay, did not have fender lips. Only the 427 SCs got fender lips. So when you look at a Cobra like the one we have here, it's basically accurate for that year. Didn't have the fender lips, didn't have the fuel filler neck on the rear, the passenger fender in the rear, because only 427 Cobra, or 427 SC Cobras had those particular modifications. That's because the original cars, or the original kit cars, were molded off of a 427 SC car by either Arntz or Butler. And probably Arntz and Butler borrowed, splashed a 427 Cobra when they made their original molds. Just so you know, that's why CMC, Fiberfab, Street Bees, Classic Cobras don't have fender lips. Now, I wasn't part of the Vicky build, but the build I did before the Vicky went into molding process changed it, because I built this one particular car, and they saw that putting an air conditioning into the dash could be done using a different steering column, or covering the steering column, or making an underdash for the steering column could be done to hide various sins that we committed during the build process. You can always tell the later versions of the CMC street rods, because they all have underdash units to cover the inside, the area between the firewall and the dashboard, because that's where we're going to put the AC. That's where we put the Volkswagen wiper motor on the bottom. Remember I told you before, we used the boat motor, or boat wiper motor, and later on we used the Volkswagen wiper motor because we basically added a little area between the dashboard and the cowling on the outside, so we had enough flip there that we could put in a Volkswagen wiper motor behind the dashboard at the top. And we still had enough room to do that. Now, while the Vicky was being done, I was on another project. I was on a project, besides the Tiffany retrofit project, I was assigned to a build where we took Porsche 911s and turned them into copies or replicas of the 959 cars. Now, this was, if you don't know it, I am a bit of a Porsche fanatic as well. Okay, remember when I went to see CMC in 1980, I sat in their Speedster for almost an hour trying to get the salesman to notice me. But I was assigned to the Porsche project based upon the yellow car build and my knowledge of Porsches. I also worked on George Levin's Rolls Royce. I worked on his Bugatti Royale because I knew how to refinish wood. And I worked on several other cars that he owned, including a Porsche 944 and a BMW that somebody sank, a BMW convertible that somebody sank into a canal, or not a canal, but a street that was flooded with water. Sank it to the point where the water came in over the top of the doors into the car. And it was my job to basically clean the car out, dry it out, make sure there was no more water in the engine, drain the transmission, drain everything where the water was, and get it running again. Believe it or not, I actually did, and it ran very well for many years. But that was part of my experience in the Marine Corps as a corrosion control expert, was being able to, and there's a term for it, and I can't remember what it's called, recover anything that had been sunk in the water. I'll remember that later on and probably drop that name back into this thing. But it was quite fun. I built a coupe version, a 911 coupe into a 911 or 959 coupe. I built one 911 Cabriolet into a 959 convertible. I also built a 911 Targa into a 959 Targa. And then I took the same Targa, cut the took out the rear window, cut off the Targa band, or the roll bar, whatever you want to call it, and then converted it into a convertible. And this is all going on while the Cabriolet, or not the Cabriolet, but the Vicky was being done. Okay, and there was another guy who wrote the Vicky manual, the original Vicky, the first version of the Vicky. The second version of the Vicky was written by yours truly, and I also created the wiring harness for the second version of the Vicky. But we're not going to talk about that now, because right now I'm coming up on 25 minutes, and I'm going to stop this right now because I don't want to go overboard on the time and stuff like that. So that's Tales from Classic Motor Carriages for this day. And I hope you enjoyed it. This is Mike, over and out.